Hello everybody, my name's Vanessa Havard-Williams. I'm a partner at Linklaters and I coordinate ESG here. And for a long time I worked for your chair, Diana Good, who was very, very good. She must be so bored of those jokes. We're very, very happy to welcome Conciliation Resources and to host what is a really, really interesting session this evening. I've been asked to do housekeeping, so please can you switch off your phones. If there's a fire alarm, it's real. We've got nothing planned, and the loos are out to the left and left again. That I think is about my job. Within our practice, we are starting to see the ripples of climate and conflict. And this is a very, very live issue that I suspect is going to get much more significant as the months and the years go by, and as we see the fallout of some of the geopolitics, awful geopolitics that we've had this year, and the concatenation of food and energy crises. And so talking about how to engage with these issues and how to build alliances of the willing is really terribly important. So thank you very much for coming to us and allowing us to share this room with you. With that said, I'm going to pass over to Conciliation Resources CEO, Jonathan Cohen, and to Justin Rowlatt. And I think between you, you are going to compare a magnificent evening. So enjoy it, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. So I'm the BBC's climate editor, and I know Jonathan, and he very kindly invited me to be involved tonight, which I'm very excited about. The idea is to discuss the relationship between climate change, the subject I cover for the BBC, and conflict. Conflict is obviously Jonathan's area of expertise. So first of all, Jonathan, can you tell us what Conciliation Resources is?
Yeah.
What do you do? Where do you work? What changes do you make?
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Justin, and thanks everyone for coming. So we're a non-governmental organisation, and we've been working for almost 30 years now in conflict-ridden countries, supporting people who live through violent conflict. I suppose the fundamental thing we're looking at is how do you make that transition from conflict being addressed through violence to conflict being addressed through politics. And we do that by working with communities, working with governments, working with armed groups, promoting dialogue, mediation. And I think one of the critical things for us is how do you support communities who live amidst the violence to actually bring about change. Our experience shows that people who live in and with violence tend to be the most insightful, the most understanding of the challenges they face, but they're not always able to get their voices heard, and they're not able always to connect with the political processes that need to change. So Conciliation Resources puts our effort into supporting those people to bring about change, and we've been doing it often at the political level. So we've supported the signing of peace agreements in the Philippines, in Ethiopia, but also working at the community level, supporting communities to reach agreements across issues like access to pastoral and farming lands, and we'll hear a bit more about that today. And in countries like Nigeria, Kashmir, and a raft of others.
You talk about seeing the human in the conflict. So, I mean, what do you mean when you talk about seeing the human, and how do you hope that will improve people's understanding of how to resolve conflict?
Yeah. Well, I mean, there's no doubt, and Vanessa touched on this. You look at the state of the world at the moment, and it often feels quite dismal. And we're stuck in discussing the geopolitics of conflicts an awful lot of the time. And we see the tragedy in Ukraine today. Several months ago, we were watching a tragedy in Ethiopia. A few months before that, we were watching a tragedy in Afghanistan. The tragedies in Syria, Myanmar, Yemen are ongoing, and we even lose sight of those. And we get caught up in the grand political games that need to be changed to resolve these conflicts. But what we're so aware of is that amidst that massive violence, there are people working at the community level trying to bring about change on a daily basis. And so it's our assertion that you need to see the human, you need to engage with the people who are courageously doing extraordinary things to bring about change in their society. And so this is the third event in our See the Human series. And for us, it's an opportunity to bring the voices of people who are engaged in that ongoing challenge of bringing peace, to bring those voices to a wider audience.
And the idea of focusing on climate change is, of course, because climate change is such a driver of conflict in the world. I mean, I study climate change. I report on climate change, every week, we see, almost on a weekly basis now, we see new kind of climate records being broken. You see floods in Bangladesh, heat waves around the world. It's become quite commonplace, really, to see these things. And as you probably all noticed, the scientists are getting much better at kind of, discerning, if you like, the fingerprint of climate change in these events, using computer modelling to show how unlikely it would be for these kind of events to happen without climate change. So we're getting a much bigger handle on the progress of climate change in the world. It's an almost overwhelmingly negative story. It makes it quite hard to cover as a story because the implications are so bad for all of us in the future. In terms of conflict, I think what climate change adds in situations where there's already conflict, climate change is a kind of multiplier. It increases the extent to which the cleavage lines that already exist become more acute because resources become scarcer, be they kind of fertile land or water. It just makes everything more acute and more challenging for people, so I imagine that it's very important in the work that you do.
Absolutely, and everything you said resonates very deeply. And I think fundamental to us is that if you look at the countries in the world that are most prone to climate change, they are also countries where conflicts are happening. I think it's something like 16 of the most vulnerable countries in the face of climate change are also 16 of the 20 most vulnerable are also amongst the most fragile, conflict-ridden countries. And I think that the challenge is that because we have to work on addressing those conflicts, we don't always think of the positives of what can be done to bring about change. You speak about the negativity that surrounds the whole climate crisis discourse, and we were talking before about the fact that the climate crisis is perhaps the greatest challenge to human security that we face. Part of the problem is you look at what happened at COP26, and it must have been like drawing teeth to try and get states to commit the resources that are needed to address the challenges that we face. Fast forward to the appalling war in Ukraine, and countries are pouring resources into military solutions. And our assertion is that we need to think about preventing conflicts. We need to use the skills of peace building and dialogue and mediation to bring about a change. And the problem is governments are prone, and people in general, are prone to look at the crisis that is in front of their eyes here and now and not have the time horizon of the crisis that is coming down the road. And I think what we're seeing in the work we're doing, and my colleagues will talk about this this evening, they'll talk about the concrete things that people in communities are doing that can bring about change, but also how the people who are experiencing the calamity already are having to look ahead and are having to plan further ahead. And I think if we take something away from tonight, it's that need to start planning ahead, but to start recognizing that you can invest in change now, not just by investing in initiatives that address the climate crisis, which we had to do, but recognizing that because conflicts proliferate to the extent that they do, they remove resources and they remove energy that has to be invested in the innovation that has to be channeled into addressing climate change.
I was quite intrigued coming down I was in Cardiff today, and on the way back I was watching the video that you made, which is being shown outside, and I was quite intrigued by your ability to find hope even amongst, you actually talked about climate change as a unifying, it's a shared experience for communities, and they both face, communities face similar challenges, and you see it as a way of galvanising people to find opportunities for reconciliation, which seems to me, almost absurdly optimistic.
Well, I suppose I've always felt that if you are engaged in peace building, you need to be optimistic. You need to be patient, but you need to be persistent, and you need to be impatient, because you're impatient for change to happen. And optimism and hope at the heart of our work. And we should let my colleagues come on and they'll tell the real story. I'm just helping set the scene. So
Laura, at the end there, Laura is Conciliation Resources Europe Asia Department Director. Recently initiated a new program on climate change and peace building, bringing together work in the Philippines, Kashmir and Uganda. She recently participated in several conferences related to this topic, including the CIPRI, is that right? Is that the right acronym? Forum in the Stockholm Plus 50 conference and the 2021 Sevilla workshop. Christine Cheng is a senior lecturer in war studies at King's College London and the programme director for the MA in conflict, security and development. Janet Adama Mohammed. Janet is West African Programme Director at Conciliation Resources. We've talked before, haven't we, about conflict in West Africa and the role that climate change has played in that, and we'll be discussing some of that later, I hope. You've got over 25 years peace-building experiencing, using both contemporary and traditional peace-building skills across a wide range of conflict contexts, including Nigeria, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, Guinea and Burkina Faso. So huge amount of experience. And on joining us very, very early in the morning, yes, in Fiji is Litia Nailatikau. Litia, that's about right, is it? Litia is Conciliation Resources Pacific Programme Officer and works with partner organisations and grassroots communities in Fiji who are directly on the front lines of the devastating consequences of climate change and conflict. And Fiji and the Pacific Islands in general, low-lying islands often are particularly vulnerable to climate change. There are lots of reasons for conflict in the countries that you look at. You try and resolve conflicts in. What role does climate play in these conflicts?
I think across West Africa, climate change is a structural factor shaping the livelihoods of people. So it brings about the unpredictability of the weather change as well. And so it affects the way the land use patterns of people. If people hitherto fetched water from a particular water point, that water point is drained, and for that matter, they have to look elsewhere. And that elsewhere they would go for water would be somebody else's water point. And that definitely becomes a cause of tensions between the two locations. But the most important thing we have to look at when we come to climate change and conflicts in West Africa is the issue of nomadic herders and crop growers, because that is the one that can clearly tell us what climate change is doing and how climate change has become a driver to the conflicts that hitherto exist in the context. Most pastoralists used to move from north to south, but now they move in all directions.
So you mean they used to follow the weather systems?
The water system. So in the rainy season, they would move back, and in the dry season, they would move further south. But now, whether it's rainy season or it's dry season, because of the unpredictability, it also affects the nature of pasture grounds, and so they move in all directions. And their movement kind of causes a lot of distraction to land use patterns of those who are sedentary. And so there is a lot of tension between the sedentary farmers and these nomadic farmers. And that is clearly showing the nature of climate change being a driver to exacerbating the existing conflicts that are between nomadic herders and crop farmers.
So there are these deep conflicts that existed already. I mean, there was the potential for conflict between these communities. And how is that violence expressing itself?
So there were tensions between nomadic herders and crop farmers, because when nomadic herders bring their animals to pass, they consume the crops that farmers have on their lands, and they consume the water. A lot of water is used by these animals. We are not talking about 15 cattle. We are talking about cattle that are moved in hundreds and thousands across the land. And there used to be some pasture routes. These pasture routes are no longer there because the pasture itself is dry. So they have to look for other sources. And so there have been tensions between the nomadic herders and the crop growers already. And then with the climate change, it has exacerbated. The water points are dry, and so sedentary farmers are now charging for the use of water points along the routes. They are now making the nomadic herders to pay. And when the nomadic herders don't pay, then it's a problem. The other thing is that governments have put in laws for the nomadic herders to obey and to adhere to as they go along the routes. And when they don't adhere to, then they are arrested and charged. And all these things are causing a lot of tensions. In addition to that, they have reserves, forest reserves, where they don't expect the nomadic herders to go to. And the nomadic herders, because there is no longer pasture, they have to steal their way. I use the word steal their way into these forests to feed their animals. And that causes a lot of tension.
And exacerbating some of the conflicts are other kind of cleavage lines. So, I mean, the pastoralists tend to be Christian, is that right? And the herders tend to be Muslim. So you've got other lines of conflict which are exploited by, you know, other actors in the community.
A lot of assumption around the nomadic herders being radicalized to come and attack the communities. At the moment, there is a lot of assumption. I'm just coming from Burkina Faso, where
I mean, this is the assumption is that this is what's happening.
Yeah, where a lot of assumption is that the second most populated ethnic group is the Fulani. And there is the assumption that the Fulani are supporting the radicalized armed groups in the north to attack the communities. So there's...
You're saying they're assuming, but the implication is that assumption is false.
Yeah, the assumption is false, but sometimes if you have not done the research into it, you cannot just conclude that they are actually doing it. And that's the point that I'm making, that there is the assumption, there is the allegation that the nomadic herders are supporting the radicalized groups as it is now.
So this sounds like a really difficult situation to resolve, a very difficult conflict to mediate. How would you begin? I mean, we don't need to do but how would you begin to try and kind of resolve some of those conflicts?
What we are doing is create Conciliation Resources, and our partners are creating safe spaces in communities for both nomadic herders and the crop growers to sit and analyze the conflicts that they are experiencing and to identify joint solutions to resolve these solutions. The challenge is when government begins to come out to identify as the owners of the land, then it brings some legalities to the issue. So then we also use our policy influencing techniques to get government actors, policy actors, to come around the table and also be part of the dialogue initiatives so that they can also release some portions of land, create new pasture grounds, and also support the creation of reserves and all that to ensure that new pathways to peace exist on the ground, and also that the people are coexisting in a better way, so they can together create that resilience with which they can resist the radicalization that is eventually and gradually overspilling from the Sahel region.
And I read about a very clever initiative you had for a kind of market where the two communities, so describe that to us, how does that work?
So in the border regions, we had herders coming from the north with their cattle. And then we had the crop growers also, they created a market where they sell their crops. And the herders would come in with their milk and their hinds, the skin of
hides, yeah.
hides, and to sell. But because there were tensions, there were tensions between the two groups, then they wouldn't meet to sell. One of the things that happened was the women group would come in with their milk and their cheese and everything to come and secretly sell to the people who, the crop growers, and buy some grain in exchange for grain and go.
But they were doing this secretly?
They were doing it secretly. And they informed us that this is what they were doing. So gradually we asked the men to find out whether they could also do something similar. But we didn't tell them that this is what their women were doing. So we told them that if they could exchange food and milk and skin and meat, but the men didn't want to do it. And then we said, could you accompany your wives? Because it's risky for your wives to go all by themselves. And gradually, they started accompanying their wives. These people would bring their wives with the cheese and the milk, and then the others would also bring their wives with the grain to come and exchange. And that's in that space, we and our partners were there to kind of let them understand that this is what a safe space looks like, and this is what a peaceful environment could create. And so eventually we created these groups called the peace markets, and in the peace markets, hitherto the herders, when they are coming to the market, they will come armed because they don't know what is in store for them. And one of the commitments was that before you enter the market, you hide your arms somewhere, and then you. So we built a list of commitments that each side needed to abide by in order to enjoy the peace market. And now the peace market has come to stay. So we have several peace markets in existence now.
Janet, that's a wonderful story. Thank you very much indeed for that. Litia, let's come to you in Fiji. First of all, tell us a bit about the kind of conflicts that you deal with.
In the Pacific, being the world's biggest ocean mass, the biggest climate issue for us is rising sea levels, which affects all Pacific Island nations and some of the lower-lying atoll nations and coastal communities much more faster than others. Some of the issues that we're facing now are maritime and territory and state boundaries coming into question. And for a region where many of our Pacific Island governments heavily rely on fisheries and tuna migration, this becomes a huge problem to revenue and security of our borders, as well as the security of our exclusive economic zones. For Fiji in particular, with our coastal communities, we've had a lot of these communities facing relocation issues. We've already started internally moving them as of beginning from 2014. Some of the issues that they're facing now are post-relocation issues, and because a lot of the Pacific and Fiji especially, we have very intimate relationships with the land, and it's a very strong part of our culture and tradition. Having to move and relocate, you lose a big sense of identity and part of your culture that we've had for hundreds of years now. So one of our partner organizations are dealing with 3 communities, being that are facing issues of post-relocation. One of the communities are facing issues where conflict sensitivity hasn't been taken into account in the climate action that has been addressed towards them, as well as adaptation and mitigation with looming relocation.
So Litia, how do you begin? Because those are these kind of issues, the issues of people being displaced, people having to migrate from their traditional areas, is one of the huge issues that will be increasingly, driven by climate change. I think in Africa alone, it's estimated that I think at 2 degrees centigrade, we're looking at something like 700 potential for as many as 750 million migrations in Africa. So a huge, huge challenge in the decades to come. How do you begin to resolve those conflicts? Because obviously you've got the challenges of people being dislocated, perhaps losing traditional grounds, but you've also got the challenge of integrating them into existing communities and, some of the conflicts that might arise from that.
Well, to begin with, as Janet had also expressed, we do work with our partner organizations on the ground. They do know the communities better. We assist them the best we can. And going into the communities, we provide spaces to be able to unpack these conflicts that currently exist, and then address what are the possible issues that may arise with the climate change impacts to come. Some examples of some work we've done recently, we've had advocacy workshops, governance mapping workshops. A lot of these communities are 200 kilometers away from the capital city, where a lot of the resources are placed, where NGOs, INGOs, civil society and government main offices are. Decisions are made here and later affect them. These are subsistent communities that are the 3 villages that we are currently dealing with are on federal level, 200 kilometers away by sea and plane. So that you can only access by sea and plane, and which was heavily affected during COVID. So beginning to address that with them, we have to address first the vulnerability of their remoteness and being located in rural areas, and then unpacking the issues that they're all currently facing. Rising sea levels, the salinity of the soil that they're living on, having to move inland, being a fishing coastal community, now having to move and become an agricultural farming community, something that they're not familiar with at all. One of the examples that we've had for a lack of conflict sensitivity around climate change action was with one of the communities that lives on 300 acres of land, which is surrounded by 5,500 acres of land that has just been sold to the Republic of Kiribati, which is facing possible relocation of a whole state, possibly in the next 20 years. So this is also internal relocation that they're facing, as well as within the Pacific losing statehood is a huge issue that's also rising.
Litia, thank you very much indeed. Laura, can I come to you, please? And tell me a bit about the conflicts, because you specialise in Kashmir, Uganda, the Philippines. You've worked in. Give us a very brief idea. I mean, presumably some of it tallies with what we've heard already, but give us some examples from where you've studied, if you could.
Absolutely, and I have the pleasure of working with a number of different teams, and we do see that the issues around the climate crisis and conflict look very different in different places, and the approaches to deal with them are different. If I take Kashmir as an example, some issues that we've not touched on yet. Around natural disaster occurrence increasing, flooding, reading in the news today of floods that were blocking off highways, for example. And we've also got, at the same time, water scarcity, which is potentially threatening water management and agreements that were put together in, I think the Indus Water Treaty was 1960. And the mixture of the water scarcity affecting the fragility of that, but also as well actually increased political tensions, also threatening that. And it's quite cyclical, we're seeing around these issues around climate change and conflict. So at the same time, the impact of militarized conflict, we've seen deforestation, is increasing the impact, the negative impacts of climate change in these areas. And we're seeing it impact livelihoods, agriculture, and therefore food insecurity, increasing tensions within communities, but also what is then the government's response? Are they blaming other governments? And again, how is this actually going to lead to not just a kind of more sustainable development, but also kind of better peace between places? And it's really at a kind of tipping point at the moment. And we're working with partners to really understand these issues, but also for them to see what can they do in their areas, increasing knowledge of how to respond, looking at the differences different communities and groups of people may face. One of some recent research we showed that women had less access to information around early warning, around natural disasters. And if we don't recognise this into how we're building into our peace-building work, we're not going to be able to achieve our peace-building aims if we're also not looking at these climate change impacts as well.
Christine, I mean, let's just broaden this out a bit if we could. I mean, do you see fundamental changes in the nature of conflict being driven by climate change?
So this goes back to the comment that you made at the beginning about the threat multiplier when you and Jonathan were having that discussion. And I think that's a really helpful framing for how we think about all of these things. Because as Janet was saying earlier, it's not just one thing. It's not just climate itself driving everything. It's more that there is an existing conflict, usually of some kind or another, and climate makes everything that much more acute, that much more felt, and brings in all of the identity issues that we're seeing. So that is a core part of this difficulty, right? So you've got already usually a whole whack of other things and factors that are making the situation, putting it right at that tipping point. Climate is yet another one that just really drives it through. So just taking, for example, a conflict that most of you are familiar with, the one in Syria, right? So not very many people talk about this, but actually about 5 years before the conflict erupted in Syria, starting around 2007, there was a very, very long period of drought. So what happened out of that process? People were driven from their lands, and they had to go find other ways of making a living because there just was no more water. They kept waiting and waiting for the rains to come. We have record low rainfalls in the Middle East. And after a while, there was just nothing there. So where do you go? You go into the cities and you look for a job. What does that do? Well, that changes the dynamic of the cities. So you have all sorts of people who are now displaced, need to be relocated, they're away from their family and friends and social networks. All of that leads to a degree of alienation. People can't find employment. They lose their livelihoods. They have to find a new way of making a living. Some of them end up being driven into the arms of the groups that we're talking about now, right? So it's not that climate itself made it happen, but this leads to that, leads to the other, leads to them being in the cities, leads to them feeling all of these things, and then leads to, in part, what we ended up with in Syria, right? These uprisings that happen and people are dissatisfied. They're dissatisfied with all sorts of things.
Well, in the first instance, helping drive the Arab Spring.
Exactly, right? So this is just part of that soupy mix of things that's going on. But
so it's very hard to pick out climate change and say that is the clear driver of all of this.
But it's very
kind
hard
of there
to do that.
in the background,
it's absolutely
kind of impelling things forward.
Absolutely. But the other thing that I think we should all bear in mind, just in terms of thinking forward, right? So right now we're talking about the dynamics going on at the moment. But if you think out, say, 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, which is really where we should be thinking about things, what's going to happen to the Middle East? What's going to happen when all of these places that really rely on petroleum and natural gas and hydrocarbons to make their living, what happens when those sources move into a renewable energies frame and nobody needs their resources anymore? What happens to those places?
I mean, some of the countries, some of the Emirates, for example, are trying very hard to think of and Saudi Arabia think of a kind of post-oil future. But the other thing to think about is those countries. Some of them are kind of basically unlivable now. You see places like Kuwait see regularly summer temperatures over 50 degrees centigrade, which is not is not somewhere you can live without huge energy resources delivering you kind of air conditioning and that kind of thing. So we're already seeing the potential for really serious issues of livability in those countries.
Absolutely. Which speaks to what Laura was saying earlier about water scarcity, right? So all of these things are coming into play now.
Yeah, so a lot of issues. Let's talk a bit now about how Conciliation Resources can work with people in areas of conflict and help support them. And Litia, let's come to you. I mean, describe to me how Conciliation Resources, the skills that you've got. How do you begin to try and resolve some of the conflicts you've described?
Thanks.
we've begun with creating spaces for these communities with our partner organizations and bringing together different members of these communities to be able to address these issues. We have workshops for them explaining processes where they can access resources already available and assistance already available, as well as using traditional knowledge and methods that are already existing to them. One of the last workshops that we've had was an advocacy workshop where we had governance mapping within for these communities. These are subsistent communities usually, where they lived off the sea and the land. They've never really needed assistance, but having to now relocate inland, not being able to assist the food, and that the livelihoods have been directly affected. They're no longer able to farm the same way. They now do need government assistance, which is centralized here in Suva. So being able to prepare them to identify with systems that they've never really had to before, be able to articulate these issues for themselves and to present them for themselves to government officials who we connect them with, as well as civil society members and INGOs and NGOs on the ground, has made quite a difference in the last 2 to 3 months, especially. They finally, they've had government representation visit their villages. Wunindongalore, which was the first village in Fiji to be relocated back in 2014, has faced post-relocation issues that hasn't been addressed for the last 8 years. But having the workshops and being able to present comfortably in a space that they felt well prepared for, that they were able to articulate themselves to the government officials. They finally had government officials visit their communities and are working together towards resolving some of the issues that they're facing.
Are these issues actually conflict, or are they just, a community that's excluded from mainstream society?
There are conflict issues because where they've been relocated to is land that is on the boundary of another village's land. It belongs to other people. Navia, for example, is the community that lives in the middle of the land that's been sold to the Kiribati government. They've had a long history of conflict with identity, being originally Solomon Island farmers that have been brought to Fiji and haven't really been recognized as Fijian. So they've had a conflict of their identity not being recognized. The land that they're on, they don't feel like they currently own. So they have that security issue. There's also a salinity of that land due to rising sea levels and erosion of the river nearby. And now they have nowhere to move because the land's been sold to Kiribati. Conflict hadn't been identified prior to it, but now it's trying to be resolved after the sale. And where do they go from there? It's a huge question because land is owned in clans in Fiji. There's a system to it, so you can't just relocate people to land that's available because it essentially does belong to someone. It belongs to a group of people. And you have to be able to identify these issues beforehand. You can't just react anymore, and it's something that we really have to look into because it's not going anywhere. These impacts are getting more severe and frequent.
And that points to another issue, Laura, which is that the work of an organisation like Conciliation Resources relies on governments being able to offer support and play a helpful role in all of this. And one of the things that we see increasingly is governments being less interested in doing that and also less able. A kind of breakdown of the ability of governments to govern well, if you like, around the world. I mean, is that an issue that you see where you're working?
Absolutely, and I think also, there is a lot of funding for climate change response, although, as we've said, there's perhaps not as much as there should be, and actually is it getting to where it should be. There's a statistic that I think there's, in terms of climate finance, $2 per capita in fragile states and $160 per capita, the equivalent of, in other developing countries. Yet, as Jonathan said earlier, the countries most affected are those that are some of the most fragile. So there is a lack of mismatch in resources. There is also the aspect of inclusive governments. in terms of what Litia was saying, and how you're engaging with communities. And that's a really critical aspect. And that is something that I think as peace builders as well, as we are able to work with communities, with different governments as well, but also help that relationship. And that's where we need to make sure that peace building and climate change are working, actors on both are working together. And if we don't, climate change responses, we talked about climate being a risk multiplier, but also our actions in response to it can also add to conflict risks as well. So where are people moving to? Where are they being moved to? Who's deciding that? How does that potentially increase the potential for conflict?
Janet, who do you work with to try and resolve some of the conflicts in the region that you work in?
I want to bring the link between climate change and a conflict that we worked on to illustrate how we
That'd be great.
So recently I went to Burkina Faso in the Cascade region, and they have forest reserves. And in these forest reserves are gold mines. And that's one of the things that is happening, that with climate change, the forest reserves are getting bare and bare. And because of that, the communities can see what is happening in these reserve areas. So there is extraction of wood, especially the redwood, and also there's mining of gold, the artisanal mining of gold in these areas by unauthorized persons or companies, some of which are foreign and all that. And so because it lays bare, the young people in the communities are also saying that they are not going to allow people to come and take what rightly belongs to them and their future. And there have been tensions between young people, their community leaders, the local authorities. If you understand how the structure of authority is in Burkina Faso, and the young people in the communities. So Conciliation Resources and our partners identified this as an issue in the Cascade region, and we are there to conduct participatory peace-building researches in which we identify also opportunities for development, opportunities for building peace and so on, and political progress. And so we identified this as an issue, and we went to the prefects, sous-prefects, and everyone of the local authorities and said we wanted to work with them to make sure that there is peace in the region. We also talked to the traditional leaders, we talked to the market women, the bike riders, the transport unions, everybody on the ground. So it became a keen interest, and we sat down to find out why is it that the young people in the community are constantly violent, as they put it. So the young people too came and presented their concerns. And that's what we do. We try to bring the two parties together. We bring not only the local community people together, but the community people, we build their capacities, and we empower them to be able to articulate their concerns. If not, they will take the violent approach. And so we support them to identify alternatives to violent ways in which they can present their issues. And then they present their issues to the local authorities, and the local authorities realize that, oh, this is actually something that is in support of their governance. And so they team up with the young people, and they are now engaging with the national people for change.
And how effective has that been in terms of resolving some of this conflict?
Because the local authorities have realized that it is the national office that usually sends these people into the area to come and do the extraction without following the local norms and bylaws, they are standing with the young people. So the hitherto tensions between the young people and the local authorities is no longer there. And now there is proactive engagement between the local and the national authorities to ensure that companies that come to do the extraction follow the bylaws and the local norms, for example.
Janet, that's another really good story. I mean, Christine, what does that tell us about the need to understand, the details of a local conflict? Because, from what Janet and Litia were saying, you really have to understand the granular detail of a local conflict in order to begin to be able to resolve it.
I couldn't have said it better myself. So I have to say, I'm on the stage because I'm a trustee of Conciliation Resources.
No, you're not. You're on the stage
Right,
because
so
you're an expert in conflict.
I am. But I am also partial, but also impartial, right? So these people can't toot their horns the way that I can for them. And I will say that one of the reasons that I love CR is because of the way in which this work is done. It is because...
So describe, what is the method? If you had to summarize the method, if you had to kind of describe it.
Contextually careful, I would say. Part of what I think to pick up in the conversation here, it is that CR stays in places for a long time, and it's really expensive to do that. You need people on the ground who know what it is, that this is the particular trigger, but it's different in every community, right? It's not going to be the same in every case or in every region. You can't do that unless you are there for a period, unless you gain the trust of local people. You have to know who to talk to. And if you don't do that well, you end up causing more of a problem than if you had done nothing at all, right? So this is one of my favorite things about CR, and this is why I'm willing to spend my time and be a trustee, and got pulled in by Diana and Jonathan into all of this. And that's why I'm speaking here today. I really believe in the work that CR does. So I'll set that aside as the bit of, my little, folks can't say, all nice things about themselves,
Your
so
bit of
let me say them. Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm going to be the advocate for, all of the great work that they do. But, speaking just more about the context here, being that kind of careful is really, really important. Things can go very, very wrong if you don't understand the dynamics of the situation, and you can make things much, much worse if you are not careful in that way. So yeah, that's one of I think my very favorite thing about CR.
I mean, and does that reflect your experience in the areas that you work in? And draw specific examples if you can. You talked a bit about Kashmir, but you also work in Philippines, don't you?
And absolutely, I think the importance of being contextually careful is just a really great framing of that. And I think if we're also looking at how do we work together as actors who work in the environmental climate change space and as peace builders, and what do peace builders bring into that? It is that contextual carefulness and that knowledge, that's incredibly important. And I think to bring an example in, actually I'll bring in one from our work in the kind of Uganda and South Sudan border areas, where we're working with satellite and data and weather mapping. And Justin, you mentioned actually earlier the kind of the data that's available and what that can tell us. And there's some incredibly rich data out there. And we can use technology now to say, actually, if we look at weather, what does that impact on how on the land, on agriculture, on how that might impact movements of people? Where are the conflict hotspots going to be? And that's why we're trying to use this data to identify that. But what we are importantly doing, and what we are bringing as peace builders into this, is we're working with partners and communities to build their confidence and capacity to use this data, to make sure it feeds into conflict mitigation tools, practices and politics, recognising that actually in many areas there have been mechanisms to address conflict, because there have been movements of people for many, many years. But it is the increased strain from the extremities of climate change that are putting pressure on this, and how do we better equip communities in that? How do we make sure communities, different parts of those communities are able to access this data, bringing young people in? How do we help them to take their information and go to their local governments and say, this is what we need? So I think this really can be, a real positive when we are able to work together between different sectors on this. And I think the aspect of being really focused on what are the local dynamics and trusting the communities to come up with their own solutions. It's not us saying, here is some great data. It's them actually being able to use that and identify what they need to address the issues.
Yeah, Christine, I mean, do you think there's more that we could do to get different sectors working together? So obviously peace building, climate organisations, aid agencies, local government, law firms, businesses. I mean, how do we get them to integrate? How do you bring them to bear on conflict resolution?
This is the start of the conversation, right? And I think this is part of the difficulty, right? So I think most people in this room, I suspect most people in this room, raise your hand if you are actually on the peace building side of this, right? So. And raise your hand if you're on the climate side of this. Okay, I think that says it all, right? So you can see there are very few people that are as yet engaged from the climate side of this. And we tried, actually. I think, I really strongly suggest we need to get more climate people into this event and into this conversation today, because that's where the tensions are going to be in the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years, right? Look at the second, third, fourth order effects, and you can't escape that inevitability. It's just going to happen. The migration patterns are going to end up such that people are going to move up through Central Africa, just as a for example. They're going to end up in North Africa, they're going to move through Libya, and then they're going to end up on the shores of Greece, of Italy, and guess what? Eventually of the UK. It's just...
Well, you see it happening already. I mean, let's be honest. And you see the migration across from Asia, from Afghanistan, which incidentally has had a decadal drought, which is underscoring a lot of the challenges in Afghanistan. It's not just about the Taliban. It's also about a long-running drought that's made it much more difficult for them to grow food in Afghanistan, and shortage of water resources and that kind of thing.
Self-interest, right? I mean, we should care if for no other reason than for self-interest's sake. And having said that, to go
another
back...
example of conflict resolution drawing hope out of the most the negative sides of things, that self-interest should be a driver of these things, but of course it is.
But you have to bring in all of the partners, and that includes the private sector, that includes people who work on climate change and
when
the energy
you say bring
transition.
them in, what do you actually mean? What do you want them to do?
At least let's start with a good conversation, and moving on from there, thinking about, well, you know what, communities like where Litia are being completely displaced, where do they end up? Do we have a responsibility in this room, in a sense, of paying for their relocation, right? So all of this does come back, and if we don't, then you're going to end up with forms of conflict that we will have to pay for in other ways, right? So it's not like it's just going to vanish and we can ignore it. Eventually, it will come back, and so the policy-making aspect of this at the governmental levels, and I know there are FCDO friends in this room who are thinking about this already. But even on the defense and security side, there are implications here. And part of that maybe is allocating some of that funding to being preventative instead of, addressing issues after the fact.
So listen, we want to throw this open to the audience. We've got some very expert people here, and I'm sure you've been engaged by our discussion. But before we do that, we wanted to go around and ask our panelists whether they'd, what in your work gives you hope. Now, Janet, you've already given us quite a bit of hope, so I'm going to start with Litia here. Litia, what gives you hope in the work that you do?
A strong point that Christine brought up is how CR essentially spends time in communities. And for the Pacific, that goes to Pacific values, giving face value, giving time, especially to communities and individuals who don't usually get the chance to speak, creating those spaces. A good example that has given me hope recently is in one of our workshops. It was over 3 days. On the last day, we had representatives from donor agencies come to the table, as well as a government representative, which is not usually heard of. And we set it up in a way that the communities presented first before the government spoke to them, and so that the government would essentially respond to their points. And what was really beautiful to see was that amongst the panelists of these three communities was a 19-year-old Indigenous Fijian girl. And for her to speak, being from our culture, from our traditional societies, it's very unheard of. Women essentially don't speak. There's a village headman who speaks for everyone. But having these workshops, identifying that everyone needs to have a chance at the table to be able to speak. And she spoke so beautifully, and she addressed the need for where they need water tanks, where essentially how it should be built, how they've been relocated near a roadside that is a dusty road. There's issues of traffic they've never had to deal with. And for her to be able to articulate it, to joke around with the government representative that they could fix all the roads like along that way, it was really inspiring to see. And it goes to the point of building the capacity, but also helping communities realize and reinforce their own capacity and articulate it themselves. That's given me a lot of hope in this work.
That's very powerful, Litia. Laura, what about in your work? Give us an example of hope.
So for me, it's about seeing spaces where people have been coming together to discuss these challenges, seeing this almost as an opportunity to bring people together. And best example for me personally of that is last year, just before COP started, being invited to a meeting where we had scientists, environmental actors, entrepreneurs from India and Pakistan together discussing a joint environmental facility across the Punjab. And to be honest, the peace builders were able to sit back and just watch the discussions and these ideas of how could we address air quality and issues that don't stop at national borders. And for me, examples like that give me a lot of hope.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Janet, what about you? You've given us some great examples of hope. Give us one more.
Yeah, and that's why I'm going to answer the question you asked, what can be done to bring climate people and peace builders together?
Go ahead.
I prefer to answer that one. Since I've been doing hope.
Answer it.
I think the issue of predictability and predictability is a major driver to some of the tensions we have. People have lost hope in terms of where their livelihood could be in the context. And so if climate people could help in that direction to work with peace building actors to determine the climate change, the timeliness, the changes in the seasons, and also for the people themselves to also begin to identify the opportunities in that. I think that is one way in which we could work together to help the people to predict what happens in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And unless we work together as actors in these different arenas, we are not going to be able to help the people. We have to begin to work together as people from climate and as people from peace builders and working with governments in this context to be able to help. For me, it's a step forward. It's also an area of hope that we can do it. And so even though there are few climate people here, I think we can do it. And
it's actually one of the things. So Egypt's taking over the COP process, the climate negotiations, and one of the things that Egypt wants, among many things, a lot to do with redressing some of the kind of fairness issues between developed and developing world. One of the things they want to do is build capacity for much better weather forecasting in developing countries to address exactly that, to give a much more of a so people understand what weather events are coming and can make precautions against them. Christine, optimism and hope, please. You're quite good at that.
I have lots, and I think it starts in this room, really, right? All of you are here because you care, and I'm going to single out my students over in that corner there, and that's where I think really the true hope comes from. It is people of the next generation. I'm in my late 40s. People who are in their 20s are just not standing for it anymore. And people in their teens are even angrier, right? And they are out in the streets and they are driving political change. And that is tremendous, right? It comes up through the political parties, it comes up through the political system, and it puts pressure on politicians to do something and to say something. And the amazing thing about the UK is actually there is a huge degree of unity that climate change matters. That is not the case in most countries, right? We can't take that kind of political will for granted. So I would say, of all places, actually, the UK it actually really cares and it wants to put its money where its mouth is. Maybe not yet with this particular government, but moving in the right directions. At least the rhetoric is on the right.
The rhetoric's quite good, yeah.
Yes, exactly.
The delivery not so much.
We should take hope from that.
So let's throw this open to the floor. I imagine we did a climate versus conflict resolution people. I'm sure there are quite a few lawyers in the audience as well. And I've kind of got a question for you, which is a bit unusual to throw. Normally I'm trying to stop people expressing opinions. But it just struck me in our discussion that actually a lot of the things we talk about, a lot of the mediation issues that we talk about are something that lawyers deal with routinely. And I just wonder if there's any lawyers amongst us feel that, would like to talk about perhaps the role that lawyers can play in all of this and their expertise in essentially conflict resolution, which ultimately, of course, is what law is about. Sometimes by generating a bit of conflict. Is that something anybody want to pick up on? If not, let's just throw it to questions and see what people have.
If not, we'll create a scenario and then they will...
And we can play, offer them a contract and they'll definitely step up, I'm sure. So there was a question there.
I'm Tamsin Barton and I'm the chair of the Independent Commission for Aid Impact. So when Christine was asking, put up your hand if you're climate or if you're peace building, then I didn't put up my hand for either, because our job is...
Put up both hands.
Our job is just to scrutinise all UK aid for whatever it's used, and we've actually embarked on a review looking at peace building on the one hand. We've done some reviews looking at climate. So I'm here to learn, and of course I've been learning a lot from you already. Really interested in those practical stories that you've been telling, because that helps give us good examples that we hope that the UK aid to peace building can make use of. So the thing I'm interested in is gender, women in peace building. I read, and I'm sure you've written lots about this, Christine, that involvement of women is absolutely crucial for lasting peace. So I just wonder if you have any sort of practical stories about this link between climate, gender, and women's roles in peacemaking.
We heard a bit from Litia just there. Do you want to pick this up, Christine? And
I think I should defer to the stories. Yeah.
Litia, you are clearly, it's very important in the work that you do. You've already told us the story of this wonderful young woman who spoke up on behalf of her community in a setting where she wouldn't normally talk. What role, more generally, do women play in resolving conflict and tackling the challenges of climate change?
Thank you. That's a great question, because it is an upcoming field and issue. And in the Pacific, and Fiji in particular, probably arguably all around the world, women know the most about their home. They know the most about their community. They drive, they know the allergies people have, they know the injuries people have, where the disabilities are, where the minorities are. They have all that knowledge, and when disaster strikes or when there's climate change issues, when there's conflict, it's the women who the village heads, the men, turn to for this information. And it's slowly being recognized that given the space to speak, women will speak and articulate the needs of the community much better than anyone else. And the younger women and the younger generation being given that space as well, being able to speak, they can speak for the whole community, because they also have powerful resources at their fingertips that they're also able to access and realize what's going on in the world more than their elders are, and explain it to them in a better sense. But we've given the space and we've helped the communities realize that and unpack it slowly, because it is a very sensitive structure to, we come from patriarchal societies, to give women that space. It is for the men as well to be able to understand that and understand the importance of it, and having them support the women and to be able to articulate those that information, the needs, the ideas and the issues. It's made a world of difference. And as in the story before, it's a good foundation of better things to come, we hope.
Litia, thank you very much. Janet, development more generally, empowering women is a hugely important theme. But, Litia hints at a potential conflict that empowering women can have with the men in the community. Is that something you find it hard to resolve? Because I get the sense, just your market story suggested that you work very closely with women in the work that you do. How do you resolve the potential conflicts as you begin to kind of empower women and sometimes presumably make them challenge the behaviour of the men in their community?
I think the issue of gender is often, especially in West Africa, is often seen as a Western agenda. And so people don't want to have anything to do with it. So we approach
Is that the men in the community or the women and the men in the community? Do women also say, oh, this is not an agenda for us?
There are some women of power and authority who would see it also as a Western agenda. So it depends on how you look at things. And what we do is we do in-depth analysis with the communities on masculinities and looking at what positive masculinities does and what negative masculinities does, the impact that that has on their communities. And using that lens, we are able to then go in depth to discuss issues of gender and inclusion, looking at other intersectoral groups within the community. So we don't just go headlong to look at what gender is not, the power to, the power of, and power over. We don't do things like that. But we go in with the masculinity lens. And we go in with the lens of masculinity and violence and how we can both transition and transform the violent masculinities to become positive and peaceful masculinities. And using that lens, we are able to now talk about the gender dynamics in the communities. So for example, in Northeast Nigeria, we were able to get community leaders to begin talking about what do the women see. We went to the community the first time, and it was only men. And I was the only woman in the place, and they gave me a chair to sit. And I said, no, I want to sit on the floor. And I sat on the floor, and I said, could my colleagues join me here? And eventually, because of that attitude, it made them give all the women chairs because they didn't want me to stay there. So the women were sitting on the chairs and the men were sitting on the floor. And that is just a simple dynamic of how you can switch the power dynamics in a community. And they would come out for meetings alone. But I tell you, when we worked with them 2 years down the line, then youth were in place, women came around, and young people too were in the same space. And they themselves were saying that the whole dynamic has changed and it looks more beautiful. It's richer in discussions. And so the chiefs themselves, the Bulames and the Lawans, everyone, when they want to organize a meeting, they themselves will set a quota. They say, can we have the Christians here? Can we have the women? Can we have young women? Because they've realized that the elderly women have their own ways of expressing themselves, and so they want to also bring in the younger women. It all depends on the way we introduce our peace building to the communities. If we go there and want to show that we are experts, they would treat us as experts. So stay there with your knowledge, and we will deal with our issues in our own way. But if we go as learners, we always say we've come here to learn with you. And along the way, should we identify things jointly, we can do them together. And that's the approach that Conciliation Resources works in this context. So it's not about gender analysis to talk about power dynamics and all that. Yes, we do that, but the technique of doing it is such a way that it gives ownership to the people themselves. And they feel really empowered and feel excited to be talking about these issues in the end.
Excellent, Janet. Is there anything you want to add to that, or should we go to another question?
I think you should go to another question.
Let's go to another question. Yeah, let's go. Well, actually, I might hold you back, actually. Harriet, no, as the chair, I think, we'll save your Olympian views. Oh, no, good. Oh, well, I will come to you.
Oh, I was also going to pick up on that, but first
can you introduce yourself?
Yeah, but I'm loving this idea, Janet. I think I'm going to have all the men sitting on the floor from now on. I'm right in there. So my name's Harriet. I'm from Ashton. We are a climate solutions organisation. So really fantastic to be really grappling with these issues of what should we be doing differently in the climate movement. given that climate's an exacerbating factor of conflict, and what can the peace-building world be doing differently? And I really loved also what you said, Janet, about the importance of jobs and livelihoods, because that's also an issue we see, that if you're going to argue the case for renewable energy for all those over 800 million people who have no access to energy, then arguing it for the jobs and the livelihoods it will help create is really an effective way to help people come on board. And so I thought that was a really interesting possible way forward to think about. And then how you train people up in the skills that therefore they would need. And actually, that's how we started to try to approach it, was to think, well, how could you work with the now 100 million people who are refugees or displaced because of conflict and also have no access to energy? So is that, again, a place with refugees? Is that somewhere we could work together? And I also thought that linked actually to the legal questions, because the whole question of a climate refugee is going to become more and more important in international law, and also looking at issues like loss and damage, and whether countries that are really under threat of their statehood could start to take cases in the international courts around the impact of climate change that we've all caused. So I thought it was a really rich discussion, and thank you, and I'm really welcome some of those starting points to work together more.
Oh, you didn't have a question?
Well, I wanted to discuss more about the jobs and more about the climate refugee issue, whether people do see that, of changing the definitions and changing how that's put into practice day to day.
Let's pick that up. Is that one you want to take, Christine?
Well, if you look at the technical definition of what a refugee is, it really is about fear of persecution, right? So you have to cross an international border and you have to have fear of real persecution. So there should be some physical threat to your life. Now, depending on how you think about, maybe there will be lawyers who will choose to interpret that threat of persecution more widely. Maybe we'll come up with an entirely new category of refugee, climate refugees. That is terminology that we are using, right? But regardless of what we call it, it's happening. And it's going to happen. The question is, how do you want to cope with it? What are the policy tools that we need to put in place? How are we going to think about our moral responsibility as a society, right? OECD countries are responsible for most of the emissions. To what extent am I personally guilty of, displacing folks where Litia is? And I think that's a real question. There is a moral component to this, and I hope that, the next COP, and the G7 and the G20 and everybody else really has a good, hard think about this, because I think we are somewhat responsible, and we should be part of the solution in dealing with that climate refugee issue.
Loss and damage, which Harriet referred to, which is the whole idea that developed nations pay developing nations for the loss and damage that climate change has caused. Well, yeah, I think that may be ultimately the only way it can be resolved, because, foot dragging does not, we're on the 7th COP this time.
Fiji should be suing.
So we've been doing this for a long time, and they're nowhere near a resolution on it.
Just touching on that, on climate change refugees, Kiribati had a case in 2015. I think it was Ioane Petitpota who applied to a New Zealand court to migrate with his family, and it was rejected. But that in 2020, last year, it now says that states are in breach. There was a landmark case by the UN that you have to take into mind the human rights obligations that states have now. And I think that's going to be a huge thing with low-lying atolls in the Pacific, moving essentially to Australia and New Zealand being our first brother-sister nations within the region. So that's something that's already happening in the Pacific and had already been attempted from 2015, and I believe just before it again in 2013.
And Litia, you also mentioned that Kiribati has bought this huge area of land in Fiji, is already planning. I mean, that obviously isn't a refugee situation. Well, they are refugees, but they've formalised the process by which they'll move. Just tell us a little bit more about that. I mean, how complicated was that as a deal, and how does Fiji feel about the fact that another state is now looking to kind of relocate into Fiji?
Thank you, Justin. Because of our Pacific values, you want to help immediately. It's the climate action that we've seen happening. You react, and there was land available. It could be sold. It was done, but the conflict the conflicts around that sale hadn't been identified because there was no precedent to it. It hadn't been done before, having another state moving into the state. So they're looking into a lot of legal issues now. Does Kiribati lose its statehood? It has one of the biggest tuna purse scenes in the world and the biggest EEZ. Do they lose that? Do they lose their right to that? It becomes an issue to their revenue, their direct revenue, their security of the state. Individuals who are known proud to be Kiribati people, do they become Fijian? How do they enter Fiji? Can they leave again? There are so many issues to unpack from it, and I feel lawyers have very strong obligation to look into these issues and read more up into it and realize that it will slowly creep into every aspect of our lives. Janet, Christina, Laura had all touched on how migration of immigrants moving into other parts of the world will happen. It's starting to happen now, and lawyers have the best position to address these issues and set up a good space for the migrants that will inevitably be coming in the near future.
You've brilliantly set up our next question, but also a response, I think, to my question.
Yes, I'm Diana Good. I'm the chair of Conciliation Resources. I was only going to very quickly on women. It's absolutely vital and a huge part and focus of our work. But if you just look at the fact that amongst UN negotiators, only 3% of them are women, you start to realize there is a massive gap. And then just quickly on lawyers, I mean, I was a litigation lawyer in this firm for 30 years. And of course, litigators deal with conflict. Yes, it's commercial, transactional conflict, but they can be very bitter indeed and global. And we land up in the courts, and yes, lawyers do know about how to deal with cases in court. But also transactional lawyers who do negotiation also have to deal with the dynamics of how do you get people together, because actually litigators are meant to mediate and settle things rather than just fight things through court, and that's what negotiators do. And the whole business of dynamics, as I was an accredited mediator, how you get people to sit down. I never actually tried getting everybody sitting on the floor, but actually getting people to move around and sit in different places and sit next to people they don't usually sit next to and listen to each other is absolutely fundamental. And I was just going to say, I mean, lawyers also, ought to believe in justice and in governance. And I also think that lawyers are good at the read across. I mean, certainly a law firm like Linklaters operates globally. Probably majority of firms do in that respect. And I think to do the read across is really important. These aren't just problems that are happening somewhere else. I mean, you only need to look at California and climate breakdown there, where in the Central Valley, temperature has reached 50 degrees on a very regular and extended basis. There's going to be, and probably already is, significant movement of Californians, and actually you only need to look at Roe and Wade, and we don't really have a United States any longer, we have divided states. And they're all armed, one starts to see, that these kind of issues, and they're profound and real, and lawyers definitely can and should be playing a major role in it.
Although in the case of American lawyers are playing quite a disruptive role. I would argue, listen, we've got 5 minutes left, so anybody who's got a question, maybe our students there, there's a question over there. Keep it quite succinct, and we'll try and get a few questions in before the end.
Thank you. I'm Dastan, studying the violence conflict development at SOAS, and previously I have worked with several international NGOs in Iraq. So, I will use the Iraq as a textbook case. I was very glad that Christine mentioned the Syria, the drought and the climate problem there, because now it's still ongoing. And we didn't talk about the reason, because I think we forgot to mention Turkey, how much is the role of the Turkey in that problem, not just in Syria and now in Iraq as well, because they have built many dams and they caused the droughts in Syria and now in Iraq. And also because the Syria and Iraq are the fragile states, they cannot do anything in that term. So what's how we can hold that countries accountable in the international like convention or like in the UN United Nations, because like I see it in the way around as well. Like we talked about how the climate change drive the conflict, but also how the conflicts drive the climate change, because like now we have a huge scale of the deforestation that the Turkey army is doing in the north, like in the Kurdistan region, Iraq, and the other places, because they're justifying is like that fighting the terrorists. So like that has a cause on the impact on the climate change as well. So that's one of the questions that I wanted to ask. Yes.
Well, I was going to say there's quite a lot in there, so I wonder if we could just quickly pick up with Laura.
Also, like I just have another question for the practitioners about like the projects that they are implementing. What are the challenges like do you face in the implementing that project? Because like for example, when we talk about the community, we say like the community, but also I work in that kind of projects. It's a very small scale. Like we are really working with a very few people. Like it's not a picture of the whole community. So like what are the challenges in terms of the budget, the timeline? Because like most of the projects are the donor driven, driven by the donor. So like that challenges, and also like evaluations.
I think we've got quite a lot of work to work with there.
Thank you.
So thank you very much indeed for that. I mean, do you want to pick up on that bigger thing? You talked a little bit about that cross-border initiative in the Punjab, was it? Gujarat.
In the Punjab region.
In the Punjab. But you also referred to the Indus Valley Treaty and the way that the water resources have become a huge source of conflict between India and Pakistan. We see similar conflicts. I mean, just Southeast Asia and China, for example. We see this all over the world.
And there's a lot to discuss there, and hopefully we can pick up some of that after this as well. But I think natural resource management in mediations is not brand new. It has been happening for some time. We're seeing a lot of previous agreements being stressed, and we're also realising now that it's increasingly important. And how do we actually make sure that in those mediations you've got people who've got that expertise is really important. But I think if I can just pick up quickly on that point around challenges, what's I think particularly special about CR's work is trying to and is ensuring that our relationships with partners are long-term, they're outside of these donor-driven project cycles. So when the project funding stops, our colleagues are still there speaking to partners in communities. And that's incredibly important for this work. And that's one of the challenges we see around climate responses, often not being conflict sensitive, is very short time frames, not enough time to actually engage properly.
And let me just pick up on that, Litia, because you're one of a number of Conciliation Resources offices around the world, aren't you? And presumably that does change the way that you can engage with issues locally. I mean, your personal expertise as a local, but also presume you can draw on the expertise of other people. It's not really a question, is it?
No.
How does it help? How does it help having a local office when you're dealing with the kind of problems you're dealing with?
Oh, it helps tremendously. Time zone. The head office for Conciliation Resources is in London. It's 7 a.m. now in Fiji. Being able, it's the time zone, it's the accounting issues, all these things you take into account. And Conciliation Resources, I'm not saying this as an officer, just because I'm an officer of Conciliation Resources, but as a local, as an Indigenous person, you do see the valuable difference when you're working with communities and you're able to relate to them, but them also to you. Being able to identify the issues, being able to speak in the vernacular, and giving them the space to speak in their own vernacular, they can articulate everything so much more better. You know what the issues on the ground are better than anyone else, and being able to be understood by my team leaders and my management that these are important ways, and being allowed to lead that process, it's a wonderful experience, and having that long-term effect is very important, because a lot of communities have a research information interview fatigue, where people are constantly coming in to interview, take the information, go out, they don't see them again. False promises are made. And then they still have to live day after day facing the same issues that they do. However, with Conciliation Resources and our partners, we've had these relationships with these communities for the last 3 to 6 years. And you unpack it, you see the change it makes, And other communities have come to the table, putting their hands up, asking to be consulted with, to be represented as well. And women are leading those changes as well. So it's a very big difference.
Excellent. Thank you very much. One quick question in. Oh, there's two. I'll take the guy in the front. Yeah, you.
I'm Neil Brown. I'm coming at this from a climate change type perspective.
What do you do? Just so we have
I've been involved in sustainable asset management for the last 10 or 12 years, so investing in renewable energy and energy efficiency, clean technologies, those sorts of things. If you look at water stress and changing temperatures and migrating agriculture, let alone people, you guys are doing a tremendous job, an incredible job in terms of looking at today's conflicts. How much time can you devote to look into the conflicts in 10 or 15 years' time, which will be different and potentially somewhere else?
Oh, and you touched on this, didn't you, Kristen?
Yeah,
You referred to the fact that we need to pay attention to this.
We do. We really do. And I think this is spot on. If you think about what the future natural resources that we'll be concerned about, obviously water. But in addition to that, lithium, a lot of the rare earths, things that we need for renewable, to deal with renewable resources, battery technology and all of that, those are where some of the, and I know people in this room, I'm looking at one in particular, people who are already working on this and care about it and can see actually the places where particular minerals, rare earths, for example, in the Congo, that's sitting in a place that is already very conflict afflicted, right? But that's also where the resources lie for the kinds of renewables that we need in the future. So just if we're looking forward to where the resource grabs are happening as we speak, and where China and the US and allies are trying to compete for those resources, and then what that looks like on the ground, that's happening now, but it will have implications for decades to come, right? So that's another place that I would say we should pay attention to that, and things could get dicey. The more important those resources are for the renewable transition, the dicier things could potentially get, and exacerbating in the same way around those identity issues.
I was going to come to you, Janet, as well. And obviously, I mean, resources are one issue. Minerals are one issue, but climate change obviously is going to drive, as our questioner suggested, well, huge changes in agricultural productivity, and some of the things that you're already seeing, which are a result of exactly that, are going to get much more acute, aren't they? I mean, how much do you worry, sitting down and doing your conflict resolution now, about how bad these, the challenges, the stresses these communities are under, will be under in the future?
I think livelihoods are changing. What women used to do, today they don't do them again. Women used to go for grass, long grass, to weave baskets and all that. That is gradually changing. What men used to do, like they farm in their locations, and in the dry season they'll go to wetter regions to go and farm. This time that is all changing, and the pressure is more and more on the land use patterns, which are also changing. The resource patterns, the policies are equally changing. Government just wakes up in a day and brings up a new policy in terms of land ownership. Most of West Africa is owned by our governments. The governments own the land, and so they determine what to do, which area should be mined, and where the mining royalties go to, and all that. And these are all tensions that are in the making, and would grow from time to time. I just wanted to talk about the community approach that you said. Conciliation Resources does not do a project in a community and leave. We accompany the communities over a long period of time. So when we go in with a youth program, for example, we empower the youth to continue to engage with other sectors of the community. And then eventually we bring in the women. Eventually we bring in the community leaders. Eventually we bring in bike riders. We bring in transport union people. And that's the way we work. So we try as much as we can not to work with just a small group. That is what you do when you have 6 months funding, or just 6 months to 1 year funding. You just do that and you come out. And what we do is we take that 6 month or 1 year funding, we go in, we do the best we can. The next time we go into that same community and we continue to work. So in one community, we have different projects, making sure that we kind of cover the community in which we work in. And maybe through that, we would cover the community as a whole eventually.
Excellent. Well, I think we have to draw it to a close. We've overrun very slightly. And if there's one more question, we're being allowed. One more question. Are you at the back? No, he had his hand up before you. I'm sorry. He gets the last question.
Thank you. James McGoran, I'm the Director of Peace Building for the Archbishop of Canterbury in Lambeth Palace. He's a great fan of Conciliation Resources and I'm sure would have loved to have been here tonight. Succinct question. Faith leaders, global, local, how are they helping in bringing together work around climate change and conflict, from your experience?
Let me throw it a little bit more open. How are they helping and hindering? Because they may be hindering in some instances. Laura, do you want to start?
Succinct question that I feel it's harder to give a succinct answer to. But we have seen the importance of faith leaders in our work at local levels, at national and levels and global levels as well. And again, I think that's incredibly true when we're talking about climate and conflict. That continues to be the case. And I think that's incredibly important to keep that conversation going, and leaders who are understanding the needs of those communities and are able to raise them and amplify them to others as well.
Litia, faith leaders in Fiji, I mean, presumably they can be a really good way of mobilising communities to do the right thing to help resolve conflict.
Absolutely, and they've also played a huge role in helping communities accept and identify that this change is coming. They relay stories back to Exodus over exile. Biblical stories of migration have helped communities understand the idea of climate change a lot better. You might not, because of the way Fiji is geographically set up, 322 islands, a huge ocean space, you won't find government representation in every community, but you will find a church. And engaging those leaders of the different religious faiths has also helped a lot in this sense, and help the communities grasp what's happening, accept it, and slowly deal with the issues that they have in front of them.
Excellent, Litia, that was fantastic. Listen, every day I have to deal with an inbox full of really negative stories about, the effects that climate change is having around the world. And it is great to be part of a discussion like this, which I think has been very optimistic. We've looked at some of the challenges, but we've also heard really hopeful, inspiring stories of what can be achieved when people sit down and talk and begin to build, reconciliation into communities. So it's been wonderful. It's been very inspiring. We got tea and coffee and biscuits, so we can continue the conversation outside.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and this is one of the wonderful things of being able to meet in person again, because wonderful to hear colleagues, and thanks to all of my colleagues, especially Litia, who got up at the crack of dawn, and thanks to you, Justin, for being such a wonderful facilitator of the conversation. But now's the chance for us to all have a conversation and to actually push one another and share ideas, and it's one of the lovely things of getting back to meeting in person. I'd like to say a huge thanks to our hosts from Linklaters, and I'll give a final word to ES in a moment. But I also just want to say, one of the things that's come up repeatedly in the conversation today has been this challenge of being able to resource this kind of work. And at Conciliation Resources, we're very conscious that we have to navigate the way in which donors operate. So we've actually recently established a Peace Building Response Fund. There's some flyers outside. Do have a look. And we're keen to build this response fund to enable us to respond at pace to situations that are very fluid, be it from climate-related issues or conflict in general, which tragically is fluid and works at a dynamic that funding institutions are rarely able to respond to. But do continue the conversation outside, but a very final word to our hosts from Linklaters and ES, please.
I'll be very brief because I know they're that side. Thank you so much. I think I speak for everyone, but and just thank you so much for such an interesting, inspiring, very heartening conversation about some of the stats and some of the issues that we're facing. because of this ripple effect of climate change, also because of the wonderful work that you guys are doing, that lots of people are doing and are modelling as well. We talked a lot about creating space, but not just creating any old space, but a space where people can actually engage, where you are you're speaking to people that speak back, not speaking into emptiness. I think that for anyone that has had to experience that, you know the difference when you're actually able to use that space properly, and bringing in so many different people. As a Nigerian woman, Janet, your comments about women's perspectives in Western Africa really resonated with me. So just thank you so much. As I said, drinks are outside. Let's continue the conversation. Let's see how lawyers can help. I know there are a lot of us in the room, so let's continue the conversation and see how we can get all of this even more mobilised than before. Thank you so much, everyone.
Brilliant. Thanks, everybody.